Ever get that feeling? Like you really want to grasp something big, something complex, but you don't want to wade through mountains of information.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, we're all about that here. Taking these big topics and, well, diving deep. Today's a good one. Walt Disney.
Oh, a fascinating one. There's just so much out there about him. Articles, biographies. We even took a good look at the Wikipedia page.
A lot to cover, right?
Right.
So what we're aiming for today is to give you the highlights, the things that really mattered in Walt Disney's life and work.
I think we can do that.
Basically, this is your shortcut to really understanding the man behind the magic. Ready to unpack it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so first things first. Where did it all begin for Walt Disney?
Well, he was born way back in 1901 in Chicago. And it's interesting to look at his early life because you can see where some of that boundless creativity came from.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even as a little kid, he was drawing, copying cartoons from the newspaper. Then you got that move to the farm in Marceline, Missouri. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Young Walt, surrounded by all those animals, drawing them?
It must have had a huge impact. Marceline's also where he fell in love with trains, something that, as you know, became a big part of his theme parks. Then the family moved again, this time to Kansas City.
That's where you met Walter Pfeiffer, right?
Right, and that opened him up to the world of vaudeville and motion pictures. Kind of set the stage for his future career, don't you think?
I'd say so. Plus, he and his brother Roy had that paper route. Talk about learning responsibility and hard work. But even with that schedule, he was still taking art classes on Saturdays. And a correspondence course in cartooning.
He never stopped, did he? That drive to learn and grow is pretty amazing. Then I was off to Chicago, more drawing, this time for his high school newspaper. Lots of patriotic stuff because it was during World War I.
And then there's that crazy story about him forging his birth date to join the Red Cross. Ended up as an ambulance driver in France. And even there, in the middle of a war, he was still drawing cartoons.
This time on his ambulance, he couldn't stop creating. When he got back to Kansas City, he landed a job at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio. And there he met Ub Iwerks.
Ub Iwerks. That name comes up a lot in Disney's story.
It does. They were quite a team. So we've got these early signs of his talent. But let's get into the nitty-gritty, the early career. Those innovative years, let's say, from 1920 to 1928.
Yeah, when things really started taking shape.
Right. So he gets laid off from Pesman Rubin, starts his own commercial art business with Iwerks. Doesn't last long, though. Then he ends up at the Kansas City Film Ad Company. That's where he's introduced to cutout animation. But he wasn't thrilled with it.
You could see the limitations. And like always, he started experimenting. And that's how we discovered cell animation.
Exactly. He even tried to convince the Film Ad Company to switch, but no luck. So what does he do? Teams up with Fred Harmon, and they start making these modernized fairy tales called the Newman's Laughograms.
Newman's Laughograms, clever. For the Newman Theater, which led to him opening his own studio, right?
You got it. Laughogram Studio in 1921. More animators joined. Even Iwerks came back, and it was during this time that he made Alice's Wonderland, a real mix of live action and animation.
Super innovative for the time. Too bad the studio went bankrupt in 1923.
Yeah, a tough break. But it sort of forced his hand, didn't it? He moved to Hollywood that same year, hoping to break into live action directing.
His brother Roy was already there, which must have helped.
Absolutely. And get this, he managed to sell Alice's Wonderland to a distributor in New York, a woman named Margaret J. Winkler. She gave him a contract for 6 more Alice comedies.
Talk about a lucky break.
It was. That's what really got things rolling. Soon after, he formed the Disney Brothers studio with Roy.
The very beginnings of the Walt Disney Company as we know it. Pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. In 1926, they got their first official studio. Things were moving fast, but then Charles Mintz came into the picture and took over distribution. That relationship got a little messy.
And then there's Oswald the Lucky Rabbit.
Yeah, yes. Created for Mintz and Universal Pictures. Seemed like a win at the time. But when Mintz wanted to pay them less, Disney lost most of his animators and, even worse, the rights to Oswald.
That must have been crushing.
It was. But in a way, it set the stage for something even bigger. And luckily, Ub Iwerks stayed loyal.
Yeah, that's where Mickey Mouse comes in.
You know it. So there they were, no Oswald. But this idea for a new character, a mouse. There's some debate about where the inspiration came from, but the result, well, we all know how that turned out.
It's funny how his wife, Lillian, suggested changing the name from Mortimer to Mickey. Could you imagine Mortimer Mouse?
Not quite the same ring to it. And Iwerks really refined Disney's initial sketches. made Mickey more dynamic, easier to animate. They were a true creative pair.
And of course, Walt himself voiced Mickey in those early days. That must have made a huge difference. I read somewhere that a Disney employee said, and I love this quote, "Ub designed Mickey's physical appearance, but Walt gave him his soul."
That's beautiful. It's true, though. It wasn't all smooth sailing at first. They actually had trouble finding a distributor for the first two Mickey shorts, Plain Crazy and The Galloping Gaucho.
What changed things?
Sound. Steamboat Willie, 1928. The very first cartoon with post-produced, synchronized sound, a complete game changer. People had never experienced anything like it. It proved that sound could make animation so much more engaging, more emotional.
Revolutionary. And I bet it helped that they finally got a distribution deal with Pat Powers.
Powers' Synphone System, it was called. Another important piece of the puzzle was Carl Stalling, the composer. He's the one who suggested the Silly Symphony series.
A whole new way to tell stories using music.
That's right. And the Skeleton Dance in 1929 was a brilliant early example. iWorks animated the whole thing. But even with all the success, things weren't perfect. Powers wasn't paying them what they deserved, which caused some friction.
That's never good.
No, it got so bad that both iWorks and Stalling left to work for Powers. And to top it off, Disney had a nervous breakdown in 1931.
Wow. He was pushing himself to the limit.
He was. He took a much-needed break, went to Cuba and Panama. When he came back, things started looking up again. He signed a new deal with Columbia Pictures for the Mickey Mouse cartoons.
International stardom.
Pretty much. And around this time, he introduced some iconic characters we all know and love. Pluto in 1930, Goofy in 1932, and Donald Duck in 1934.
It's like the Disney universe was expanding.
It was. And then came color. Flowers and Trees, 1932, was the first Disney cartoon filmed entirely in full color. 3-strip Technicolor, cutting-edge stuff back then.
And he snagged the exclusive rights to that technology until 1935. Smart move.
Very smart. Flowers and Trees was also the first film to win the Academy Award for Best Short Subject, Cartoon. Plus, Disney got an honorary award for creating Mickey Mouse.
Pretty impressive haul. But then, The Three Little Pigs in 1933, a total sensation. It won another Academy Award and really cemented his reputation.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf became a national catchphrase. This success allowed Disney to establish a dedicated story department, storyboard artists working out the narratives in detail.
He was really serious about storytelling.
He was. And this all leads us into what many consider the golden age of animation for Disney, from 1934 to 1941.
That's when he set his sights on something much bigger than shorts. Feature films.
Exactly. And not just any feature film. He wanted to do Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as a full-length animated feature.
A lot of people thought he was crazy.
Disney's Folly, they called it. It went way over budget, costing a whopping $1.5 million. But Disney was determined. He insisted on sending his animators to classes at the Chouinard Art Institute. He even brought live animals and actors to the studio for them to study, all to make the animation more realistic.
Wow. And on top of that, he developed the multiplane camera, this incredible invention that gave the animation a sense of depth.
Like you were looking into a three-dimensional world. They first used it in The Old Mill, which won an Academy Award in 1937. And then, get this, they redrew some scenes in Snow White to use the multiplane camera.
He wouldn't settle for anything less than perfect. So what happened when Snow White premiered in December of 1937?
It was an instant smash hit, the biggest film of 1938. By 1939, it was the most successful sound film ever made. Disney received another honorary Academy Award, this time a full-sized Oscar, and 7 miniature ones for the dwarfs.
Talk about a triumphant comeback.
He didn't stop there. He went straight into production on Pinocchio and Fantasia, which were both released in 1940.
Both incredible films, though they didn't do quite as well at the box office.
Sadly, the outbreak of World War II hurt ticket sales, especially in Europe. And by 1941, the studio was in serious debt. They had to go public, issue stock for the first time. And then came the salary cuts, which led to the animator strike that same year.
A difficult time for sure.
It was. Disney's management style, which some saw as too controlling, also played a role. The strike lasted for 5 weeks. Disney went on a goodwill tour to South America while things were being settled.
Did it help?
While some animators left the studio and relationships were strained.
During all this turmoil, they made Dumbo.
Released in 1941, Dumbo was a simpler film, less expensive to make, and it was a huge hit.
Must have been a relief.
It was. Then, everything changed when the U.S. entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Disney put his studio to work creating training films for the military.
And those Donald Duck propaganda cartoons.
Right. And remember, Der Fuhrer's face won an Academy Award.
Amazing how he used animation to support the war effort. But financially, the studio wasn't in great shape.
Those military films barely covered their costs. Bambi, which had been in production since 1937, underperformed when it came out in 1942, and by 1944, the studio was $4 million in debt.
How did they survive?
Amedeo Giannini, the chairman of Bank of America, believed in Disney's vision. He gave them the financial support they needed.
A real turning point.
It was. In the late 1940s, they started making fewer animated shorts. There was just too much competition.
So what do they do?
Walt Disney had an idea. Combine animation with live action. That's how the True Life Adventure series was born, nature documentaries. The first one, Seal Island, came out in 1948 and won an Academy Award.
A whole new direction.
Exactly. And then in 1950, they went back to their roots with Cinderella.
Their first animated fairy tale in 8 years.
And a huge success.
Though I heard Walt himself wasn't as involved with Cinderella. He was busy with his first all-live-action film, Treasure Island.
That's right. It was filmed in Britain, so as we enter the 1950s, Disney's starting to branch out.
More live action, TV shows,
Yeah.
and then, of course, Disneyland.
The big one. It all started with those trips to Griffith Park with his daughters, but it was a visit to Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen that really inspired him.
He wanted to create a place where families could have fun together, a place that was truly magical.
He got the zoning permits to build in Burbank, but it wasn't big enough, so he bought a larger plot of land in Anaheim. Then he set up WD Enterprises, which later became Walt Disney Imagineering.
And he used his own money to fund the early planning.
He did. And the designers who worked for WD, they became known as Imagineers. Getting the funding for Disneyland was a challenge, but eventually he convinced banks and other investors like ABC to back him.
And the rest, as they say, is history. Disneyland opened in July 1955. It was even broadcast live on ABC. 70 million viewers.
The park was divided into themed lands: Main Street, USA, Adventureland, Frontierland, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland, all connected by the Disneyland Railroad. It was a hit from the start. Within a month, they were getting over 20,000 visitors a day.
It's amazing to think how much of an impact Disneyland had on the entertainment industry and the way we think about amusement parks.
No doubt. That deal with ABC for Disneyland also included television programs.
Which makes sense. ABC was a major investor in the park.
Yeah.
And Disney had already dipped his toes into television.
Right. Remember that Christmas Day special in 1950? It was all about the making of Alice in Wonderland.
People loved it.
They did. And then came the Walt Disney's Disneyland Anthology series on ABC in 1954. It was a huge hit.
Brought Disney magic into people's living rooms.
Exactly. And then the Mickey Mouse Club in 1955, a daily variety show for kids.
And all that merchandise.
Mickey Mouse ears, lunchboxes, you name it.
They even had a mini-series on the show called Davy Crockett. It was a total phenomenon.
The Ballad of Davy Crockett topped the music charts, sold millions of records. Disney even started his own record label, Disneyland Records.
The man was unstoppable.
He was a true entertainment mogul, and it didn't stop with movies, TV, and theme parks. He was a consultant for the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow. He even created the America the Beautiful film for that, which was shown in Superama.
Superama. Those crazy panoramic theaters.
They were pretty wild. And then he was the chairman of the pageantry committee for the 1960 Winter Olympics.
Wow, he was everywhere. And on top of all that, he invested in the Celebrity Sports Center. You know, bowling alleys, things like that.
He even ended up owning the whole place eventually. And let's not forget about his collaboration with Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist who worked for NASA.
That's right. They worked on the Man in Space episode of the Disneyland TV show.
Disney was fascinated by space exploration, by the future in general.
Definitely ahead of his time. So while all this was going on, he still managed to oversee the production of some of his most iconic animated films.
We're talking Lady and the Tramp in 1955, which was filmed in CinemaScope. Sleeping Beauty in 1959, shot in Technirama 70mm. 101 Dalmatians in 1961, which used Xerox cells to make the animation process more efficient. And The Sword in the Stone in 1963.
And who could forget Mary Poppins in 1964? Another smash hit.
He'd been trying to get the rights to Mary Poppins for years. It was a passion project.
And a perfect blend of live action and animation. Disney was also really involved in expanding the California Institute of the Arts, or CalArts.
He wanted to make sure there were talented artists coming up through the ranks.
Always thinking about the future. And then there was the 1964 New York World's Fair.
He created 4 exhibits for that. It's a Small World, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, in Carousel of Progress and Ford's Magic Skyway.
Some of those ended up at Disneyland, right?
Yeah. That's right. He was always finding ways to repurpose things. He also looked into developing a ski resort in the Sierra Nevada mountains and even thought about a theme park in downtown St. Louis.
Neither of those happened.
No, but then in 1965, he announced Disney World in Florida,
The Magic Kingdom and EPOT.
the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. His idea for a futuristic city. He even started working with businesses to sponsor different parts of EPCOT.
It's incredible how much he was working on, even in the last few years of his life. He was still involved in the studio's films, too. Got a story credit for the 1966 film L.T. Robin Crusoe, USN.
He used the pseudonym Retlaw Yensid.
That's Walter Disney backwards.
Clever.
And he was also developing The Jungle Book and The Happiest Millionaire.
Tragically, though, he was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1966.
He was a heavy smoker, right?
He was. He passed away on December 15th, 1966, at the age of 65.
A huge loss. The Jungle Book and The Happiest Millionaire came out in 1967 after his death. And Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day in 1968 actually won him a posthumous Academy Award.
His legacy lived on. After his death, the quality of the studio's animated films went down for a while.
Sort of a slump.
Yeah, but then came the Disney Renaissance in the late 80s and 90s. And though his original vision for EPCOT as a fully functional city never came to be, his brother Roy made sure that Walt Disney World, with its Epcot Center attraction, opened in 1982.
A fitting tribute. And the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco opened in 2009.
Keeping his memory and his work alive. And of course, Disney theme parks are still incredibly popular. Millions of visitors every year.
It's amazing to think how much his work still resonates with people today. So what can we say about Walt Disney, the man?
He was complex, that's for sure. He was married to Lillian Bounds. They had 2 daughters, Diane and Sharon.
And he built that amazing miniature railroad in his backyard.
The Carrollwood Pacific Railroad. He even had a steam locomotive called the Lily Bell.
You can see those signs of him. The visionary businessman and the guy who loved trains. Politically, he was conservative, especially in his later years.
He was definitely a product of his time.
And though his public image was very warm and friendly, in private he was more shy, even insecure.
He was also incredibly demanding of his employees, expected perfection.
A real dichotomy.
Yeah.
So what's the final word on Walt Disney?
It's hard to say. Some see him as a patriot, a folk artist. Others see him as a symbol of American imperialism, even intolerance. There are accusations of anti-Semitism, but also evidence of his support for Jewish charities and employees, and accusations of racism, but also evidence of close relationships with people from minority groups. It's complicated.
It is. But no one can deny his impact. He revolutionized animation, created a global entertainment empire, and his work continues to entertain and inspire people around the world. So there you have it, our deep dive into the life and work of Walt Disney.
A man full of contradictions and incredible achievement.
And here's something to think about as we wrap up. Disney's vision for EPIT was a community of the future, a place of innovation and progress.
Always evolving.
Right. So how would his original concept measure up against our current ideas about sustainable, tech-driven cities? What could we still learn from his forward-thinking approach to technology, community, and immersive experiences?
Something to ponder.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.